Rusty Wade Springer, age 49, passed away peacefully on Sunday, January 19th, 2025 in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. He was born on November 10th, 1975 in Oklahoma City to Tony and Wilma Springer. He was a resident of Broken Arrow and was a 1994 graduate of Midwest City High School. He married Lori on August 12th, 1995 in Bethany, Oklahoma. He served as an evangelist with the Church of Christ for nearly 27 years. Rusty and Lori moved to Farmington, New Mexico to work with the church there for 7 years. They moved to Joshua, Texas to work with the church in Burleson, Texas for 10 years. They found their final home in the move for the church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when they moved to Broken Arrow until his passing. Rusty loved the church and enjoyed traveling to congregation to experience fellowship with many of the brothers and sisters in Christ. Church and his family were his two biggest passions. He is survived by his wife, Lori, his parents, Tony and Wilma Springer, a younger sister, Sharissa Byrne, and her husband, Isaac, 4 children, Isaac and his wife, Ashlyn, Isaiah and his wife, Amanda, Noah, and Chloe, 2 grandchildren and one on the way, Kinsley, Lincoln, and Evelyn. Rusty had many nieces, nephews, and cousins. You know, how does that make you feel? It doesn't make Rusty feel too good. But how does it make you feel? You know, it don't make me feel too good. When we see here somebody that we love, somebody that we care about, and number one, to know that they're gone, to know that they've passed away, but then to see the life of Rusty today reduced to, 2 or 3 paragraphs? Hey, like he said, he's lived 49 years here. And this is what he gets. 2 paragraphs worth of information. And y'all know Rusty better than I do and probably longer than I have. And you could probably tell stories and talk about some fun times that you had. And maybe you know some very intimate details about Rusty that wouldn't go on here, that wouldn't be necessarily appropriate for an obituary. The fact is, Rusty lived a whole life, and that's what he gets. You know, it just doesn't make me feel too good. This morning, I want to talk about death. And not because it's enjoyable, not because it's fun, a fun thing to think about, but because it's necessary. It's necessary to talk about death. And you may be like my wife. She does not like to talk about death. Every now and then I'll tell her, hey, whenever I die, I want you to do this or that or the other. I don't want to talk about it. Let's not talk about it, right? Say, when I die, don't just wait around trying to find somebody as handsome as me. That's not a good idea. You'll die old, right? And don't try to find somebody as smart as me, right? It's going to be a hard search. So this morning, we're going to talk about death. There's a few things about death I think it's important that we be aware of, that we have in our minds. I think we'll read some verses here that will help us as we begin to think about death. You know, as I look across the room here, I see people who are from a bunch of different generations. I don't know how old our oldest member is here today. I gave this sermon at a congregation near home a while back, and we had somebody who was in their 90s, in their 80s, in their 70s, so on and so forth. We had infants in the congregation that morning. And no matter how old you are today, I think it's important that you recognize death. That it's a very big reality in our lives today. You know, I Googled the word death to put some pictures on the board, and 3 of the first 5 pictures were the Grim Reaper. Now, is that death? Is that really what we should think of when we think of death? There was the skull with the crossbones there, a creepy and mysterious graveyard at night, or a candle that had been blown out. Is that death? Is that what the Christian should think about when they think about death? You know, Halloween's a major holiday, a major thing in our culture, in our country. And it's so focused on death, and people like that, and it's interesting, and it's kind of spooky, right? What should the Christian think about when they think about death? How does God view death? So why talk about death? And what's the point? We could certainly talk about other things that are very important, so why talk about death? I got a couple reasons here. Number one, death is coming. Death is coming. Whether you like it or not, we all understand and we all recognize this reality. We all live our lives with death being this looming cloud in the distance, at some distance we don't know. But we do recognize that fact, and this morning I want to recognize that fact. And then in hand with that is that life is a vapor. And if we have anybody here in those crowds, 70, 80, 90 today, they will attest to that, won't they? You know, I look back, and this year I've been out of high school 11 years. That went like that. That went quite quickly. I'm about to be out of my 20s now. We're getting real close. And I was telling a younger cousin of mine that last year, I'd been out of high school 10 years, and my great uncle walked up and he told how many years he'd been out of high school approximately, and you go, okay. He said, life's a vapor. It goes by so quickly. But finally, and a couple of the main points. Why talk about death? Because it's the usher of judgment. It's the usher of judgment. And the fact is, we live this life today, and I live my life right now, and one of these days, I will die, and I will stand before God. And you will stand before God. And death is the usher that brings us there. Folks, eternity is real. Why talk about death? Eternity is real. It's very real. You know, we're human, and we get so caught up in being humans. We get so caught up in this physical world that we live in, the physical things that we enjoy and the physical things that we have to do day in and day out. And this life that we live that's physical, it's real. And the choices that you and I make in this physical life, they will determine our eternity. But as real as this life is, and if I were to slap Topher across the face, he'd feel it because it's real. But as real as that is, eternity is even more realer. It's more real than this life we live right now. I think it's important that we recognize that. It's important that we understand that the life that we're going to live in eternity forever is more real than what we've got right now. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse number 10, it says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or whether it be bad." The things we do today, we will make account of those things. I will stand before God on His throne, and He will look at my life. He will examine the things that I've done in this physical world when He makes His determination on where my soul will spend eternity. In John chapter 14 and verse number 2, Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go and prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again," Jesus says, "and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also." You know, as we begin to dive into our topic about death today, it becomes apparent that it'd be very easy to preach a sermon on death and make it a hellfire and brimstone type of sermon. And that's not my goal today. But rather, let's be motivated with the reward that Jesus tells us about here. You know, Nathan Springer was in Wheeler 7 or 10 years ago. He preached a gospel meeting for us, and he talked about heaven one night. And he made a point that I felt kind of like a dummy for never thinking about. It was right there, and so simple, and I so foolish. It just never crossed my mind. He said, heaven is heaven because that's where God is. And hell is hell because that's where God isn't. And light bulb, okay, yeah. Hell's not just this bad place because we're told it's a bad place. That's because that's not where God is. Heaven's a great place because that's where God is. That's where God is. And so I look at hell, and that motivates me. Hellfire motivates me, and I'm sure it motivates you to some degree as well. But today, this morning, let's be motivated with reward. As we think about death, let's be motivated on wanting to be where God is, instead of just not wanting to be where He isn't. I want to be with God. So I've got 5 points here this morning that we're going to talk about that we can think that our death will be and that death in general will be or is. Number 1, death is God's plan. Death is fair. Death is inevitable. Death is a reminder. And finally, I want to look at how God views death and how that's different than you and I typically view death. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse number 2, it says, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Very simple. I can even understand this, right? We all have a time in our lives where it's our turn to be born, we live our lives, and then we die. You know, my son Zane, he just turned 2 a week or so ago. He is just starting his life. He's just had his time to be born. My great-grandmother, she passed away last year, 94, 95, mid-90s. She had her time to die. And we understand this, and we understand that there's a time to die so much, it's so prevalent in our lives that we teach that to our children. Whether we know it or not, whether we think we're doing it or not. We're forced to teach our children about death. You know, how many weeks can we go here and make announcements and not mention someone who's passed away? Can't go very many weeks, can you? Can't go very many weeks. You know, I said we teach this to our children. Like I said, Zealand's 2, and he likes to go outside and play and occasionally play with a bug and, bring mom a bug. And sometimes he gets a little happy, a little excited playing with that bug and then bring that to mom. Want to know why is this bug not playing anymore? Well, son, it's dead. You have ruined it. Go find another grasshopper. That one's dead. But probably the most classic example, one we haven't got to yet, but I'm sure we will, is the goldfish. I guess every parent has got the kid a goldfish, and the bag gets shaken, and next thing you know, that fish, he's upside down in the bag, and you have a miniature fish funeral there in the bathroom, and you have to teach your kids that this is death. That the fish is gone. And children, they don't understand that. Why can't the fish come back? Why can't he just start swimming again? And a kid has such a normal emotional reaction to that. They may cry about a goldfish for weeks, for days, as we start to teach our children about death, because we understand how prevalent it is in our lives. We've been in Wheeler at the church building there after our move from Allison since July 2013. So 11 and a half years, something like that now. Since that time, we've had 18 members at our congregation pass away. We've had 18 funerals. These folks, they had their time to be born. They lived their lives. And they had their time to die. And folks, these are people that we loved. These are family members, longtime dedicated Christians. These folks up here on the top right, that's Doyle and Sarah Jane Pond. They went to another local Church of Christ, and in their 80s they wanted to be baptized. And the elder at that church refused to baptize them. And they called my grandpa. We baptized them that day, and they were faithful members the rest of their lives. Nona Elmore lived to be 103. This woman in the top in the middle, that's Ian Jones' stepmother. G.B. Hall there in the bottom right, he spent 34 years in a federal prison for a bank robbery. Got out of prison and was a faithful member till the day that he died. My great-grandmother, Nelda Dukes. My Uncle Curtis. We got people on here who lived in all walks of life. We have a gentleman here, and I'll be honest with you, his name slips my mind. He got a bad cancer diagnosis. They walked in our building one Sunday because his wife was friends with one of our elders' wives, and he wanted to be baptized. And we baptized that gentleman, and he died 2 weeks later. Folks, this is the reality. And I suppose, Lord willing, if we're in Wheeler 11 and a half years from today, we'll probably put another 18 names up on the board. They've had their time to be born. They live their lives. And they've had their time to die. Ecclesiastes 9 and verse number 5 says, "For the living know that they shall die. But the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten." You know, every one of these people here at home that we knew, that we loved, I could tell you stories about all of them. My son won't ever know those people. What he'll know is the memory of those people. And that's all that's left now. And now in Ecclesiastes it says the memory of them is forgotten. And folks, it does me a lot of good to know that I'm not special. I need to remember that every now and then. And the fact is, I'm going to die one of these days, and they'll tell stories about me for a short time, and then for the rest of time, I will be forgotten. No one will know me. My name will never be brought up. None of my personal belongings will be around. That'll be it. The living know they will die, for the memory of them is forgotten. You know, if you'll imagine with me the church here in Tulsa 100 years from today, none of us will be here. 100 years, and in the span of creation, 100 years is but a drop, a very short amount of time. But 100 years from today, unless Zane lives to be 102, and there's some other little ones running around, no one else will be here. Every last one of us will be buried at the cemetery, unless Rusty lives to be 149. Folks, the house that you live in, if it's still standing, it'll be lived in by a stranger. That $1,000 phone in your pocket, it'll be at the bottom of a pit at the landfill. Your car, in one of those blocks you see on TV, you've never seen them in real life, I suppose they're out there somewhere smashing those cars. I've never seen them, except for on TV. And 100 years from now, Zealand lives to be 80, which I think is kind of close to the life expectancy. 100 years from now, he'll have been gone 20 years. Will anybody remember him? This small child? Folks, it's design. It's God's plan that we be forgotten. You may be like me, and you may have a Cool Whip bowl of knickknacks and things at your house, of things you want to remember. Things that were interesting or fun or cool or neat to you. I've got a whole drawer of them, and this was what I could fit in a Cool Whip bowl to bring today to look at. I got this harmonica. I won't play it. When I was probably 5 or 6 or 7 years old, Dad gave that to me, took it away 45 seconds later, gave it back to me on my 18th birthday. I want to remember that. My grandmother made stuff like this. She was artsy. Screams 90s, doesn't it? We're thankful it never made it on a t-shirt. It was probably supposed to. I found that at her house. I wanted to have that. I've got a small New Testament that someone gave my parents when I was born. I've got ash from Mount St. Helens. I've got old wallets with hotel cards from Hawaii and Florida, college IDs, a pin from my anniversary, one free cone at the Vanilla Moose in Aztec, New Mexico. You ever been there, Rusty? I thought that was better than getting a free ice cream cone. My high school senior ring, confetti from a Thunder game, breath spray I sprayed in Brenton Willingham's mouth before he kissed Jincy at their wedding. I've got a lot of things, and I certainly didn't bring nearly all of them. But you know what I've got here in my hands? I've got garbage. I've got garbage. It's nothing but garbage. You know what this is? This is my life in a Cool Whip bowl. And it's worthless. And to me and me only does this mean anything. And if I gave it to any one of you today, you'd throw it away as soon as you got home. But folks, that's my life. It does so much better of a job than an obituary could ever do. It's just stuff. It's my memory in a Cool Whip bowl. Ecclesiastes says that the memory of them is forgotten. And one of these days, they'll clean out all my stuff whenever I do die, whenever that is. And my children or my wife or my grandchildren will find that and think, what in the world have we got here? And they'll throw it away immediately. For the memory of them is forgotten. Folks, it's God's plan that we be forgotten. I think we need to know that. I think we need to recognize that. We get so caught up living our lives and doing our things and thinking that all the things that we do are important. That we need to do them. We want to create memories. We want to live a good life. And folks, at the end of the day, it's garbage. It's garbage. For the memory of them is forgotten. Next, death is fair. And I mean that in a couple different ways. Death is fair in that we all have to do it. And we all should have to do it. Probably many of you know a gentleman by the name of Elon Musk. They say he's approaching $300 billion in net worth. You know what? Elon Musk has to die. That's fair. Death has no favorites. Death doesn't say, well, if you're this rich, you don't have to die. If you're famous, you don't have to die. And then here's me. I'm not worth $300 billion. I'm not worth $300 million. I'm not worth $300,000. Should I keep going? I'm going to die. And Elon Musk is going to die. And that's fair. We both have to do it. Doesn't matter how famous or how rich he is. And he may have more people at his funeral, and he may have more powerful people at his funeral, and he may be buried in a nicer box than I'll be buried in, but we'll both be just as dead. And we're both going to stand before God. All the same. All the same. Folks, it's fair that we die. In the other sense of the word, Romans chapter 5 and 12 says, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." You know why death is fair? In this sense, death is fair in that we deserve it. Because we're sinners. Whether we'll admit it or recognize it or not, we're sinners. And the Bible said that death came into the world because of sin. And whenever you commit a sin, you're subject to spiritual death. And thanks to the sin that's in the world, we're all subject to a physical death as well. And since we've all sinned, I suppose the most fair thing that's possible would be for each and every one of us to drop dead right now. It'd be fair. It'd be just. It'd be well-deserved on each and every one of our part for me to drop dead right now. Because I've committed sin. Folks, we're all going to die. Death doesn't pick favorites. And death's fair because we all deserve it. I began to think about, as I put this sermon together, the most prevalent, the most common fears that you hear of, that people have. And I suppose that death would be one of those most common fears. Many people fear death. And I didn't look these up, so if you look it up and they're different, then don't get upset. But fear of heights. Everyone's seen this picture, right? It's some skyscraper in New York City or some other major city. And these gentlemen, they're enjoying their lunch. They're on an I-beam high above the city. And if you have a fear of heights today and you're looking at this picture, it's probably cringing you out. That's probably a little bit hard to look at. I don't have a fear of heights. It's a little bit hard for me to think about enjoying my lunch there on that beam. Claustrophobia, it's the only one whose name I know. Fear of tight spaces, and if I'm a Zybach, if you noticed my size, I'm usually the guy who has to go into the tight space to do whatever the thing is. Been at my sister's house, crawling under there, fixing their plumbing, because I was literally the only one that could fit in there. It's not enjoyable. I had developed this or inherited this from my mother. She has a great fear of tight spaces, and so do I. I hate elevators. I won't get on them unless it's absolutely necessary. Because I hate tight spaces. This right here, if you've never heard of it, it's called spelunking. I only know that because it's a great fear of mine. That's where these people go into these caves hundreds of feet down in the earth and explore these caves. And there are people who go in there and they do not come out of there. They say there's some of these passages that are so small they have to let the air out of their lungs and squeeze through a tight passage to get to the other side. I think I'd rather die. I really do. I really do. Kill me now, because I'm not doing that. It's a great fear of mine. Fear of snakes. Fear of spiders. The only one I looked up, the most common in the United States, fear of public speaking. These are the most common prevalent fears that I could think of off the top of my head. And as I began to think about them more, I realized that these are all avoidable. If you don't want to speak publicly, you don't have to do that. You could deny any request to do that. If you're afraid of snakes or spiders, you can stay away from them. And anytime you get near one accidentally, you can just run. They're not fast runners. You can stay away from them. You certainly don't have to go spelunking. If you don't want to get in the elevator, you don't have to do that. I've avoided it many times by taking the stairs. Fear of heights. No one's forcing you to do this. No one's forcing you to get up on your house and fix something or climb the ladder or change the light bulbs or whatever it is. Every one of these, and I suppose every other fear that you can think about and that you could come up with right now, if you really, really wanted to, you could avoid them. But folks, you're gonna die. You're gonna die. It's the only fear that's inevitable. It doesn't matter what you do, you will die. You will pass away. We can't stop it. Many have tried. Many have tried. And maybe we can slow that down, and I know we can speed it up. But the fact remains that death is one of the things in life in Texas that are inevitable. You know, I heard it said that if we would hire a nutritionist to plan out the most healthy meals for ourselves, and we'd never stray from that diet. If we hired the personal chef who will fix all the meals using only the purest and the best ingredients, if we'll hire a personal trainer who will help us work out all our core muscles and we do that all perfectly to a T, we will die healthy. How do you like that? We'll die healthy because death's inevitable. We can't stop it. We can't keep it from happening. Hebrews 9 verse 27 says, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment." I have an appointment with death. And you have an appointment with death. And rest assured, it's an appointment that each and every one of us will keep. The oldest woman in the world at the time I gave this sermon, which had been nearly a year ago, was 117 years old, lived in Spain, born in 1907. That's the age of my great-grandparents. 1907. You know, anybody born, she was born in April of 1907. Anybody born before April of 1907, everybody is dead. Everyone born before that date has had their time to die. They've kept that appointment. And we don't know when that appointment is. But one thing that the Scriptures tell us that we can rest assured of is that we'll keep that appointment. In Psalms chapter 90 and verse number 12, it says, "So teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." Folks, death is a reminder. Our death that we see in the distance, that we know is inevitable, let it be a reminder for us. Teach us to number our days. You know what? Just the simple thought, just the simple recognition that you will die and that you're going to die and that you're going to keep that appointment, just understanding that and waking up and knowing that fact will do what? Will make you make better choices. It will make you apply your heart to wisdom. It makes you want to stay away from temptation and avoid sin when you know that you will die. And once you accept that fact. So I began to thinking about this. What if we knew our death day? You know, our birthdays in our culture are a very big thing. We all are very aware of our birthday, and you know, as you get older, your birthday's really not that big of a deal. It's really not that important. Even so, while I don't get super excited about my birthday anymore, I've always got this internal clock, and I always kind of know about how far away I am from my next birthday. I was born March 2nd, so I'm 6 weeks away from my next birthday. I can do the math pretty quick there. And if you ask me any other time throughout the year, I may not be super close, but I'll kind of give you an idea. It's looming in the back of my mind. and I assume it is for you too. Maybe I'm a weirdo. I don't know. I'm very aware of that. So what if you knew your death day? Would that make you apply your heart to wisdom? We all can be very honest with ourselves right now and understand and recognize the fact that if we knew our death day, immediately we would start making better decisions. Immediately. Imagine with me your death day is tomorrow, January 20th, a Monday. Tomorrow, January 20th, you die. If we go back to the end of last year, say August, September, and you knew you were going to die January 20th, I think last year in August or September, you would be aware of that date. And as you flip the calendar over to October, you'd know you only have several months left. And as October flips over to November, when it got to December, you'd know you only had 6 weeks left to live. And as December and the new year comes around, you'd be so aware. With every day that passed. Folks, if you knew you were going to die, you'd lay awake at night and you'd beg God to forgive you. You'd plead with God that nagging sin that's been lingering around, you'd kick it. You'd kick it to the curb. That person in your life who you haven't forgiven, you'd go and you'd forgive them. The person you need forgiveness from, you'd go and you'd beg forgiveness. Every day you'd open up your Bible and you'd read. You'd pray to God. All day, you'd pray and you'd pray and you'd pray. You'd make sure that you were right with God. You'd make absolutely sure, if you knew that day was coming, if you saw that day. What a great reminder our death can be. Back in Ecclesiastes it says, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. A good verse here, an interesting verse. You know, not only can our death be a great reminder for us, but other people's death can be a great reminder for us. Whenever I go to a funeral, and for me, for whatever reason, particularly the graveside, that makes me sit there and think about my own death. I stand there and I think about my own funeral, and I may think about who will be at my funeral. Will people be sad? Will they be glad? But it makes me think about the way I'm living my life. And without fail, every funeral that I go to, I leave that funeral thinking, I've got to make some better choices. I've got to do better at this. I've got to do better at that. You know what that is? You know what I've described there? I've described going to the house of mourning. You know, we could go to a funeral and we could go to the house of feasting. We could just throw a party and we could just try to put those bad thoughts out of our mind. But we read here, it's better sometimes to do that. To make yourself go to the house of mourning. To force yourself to think about some things that aren't pleasant. It's good for you. That the living will lay it to his heart and apply his heart to wisdom. Let's allow other people's deaths that are inevitable as well to be a great reminder for us. Let's force ourselves when we're at that next funeral to think about our life. To stand around that casket and examine yourself. And let that be a motivator. Let that be a reminder that you too will die. Because one of these days at home, Chuck Robertson, our local funeral director, he will roll my body in a casket up to the front of our church building. And they will have my funeral. And one of these days, they will do the same for Rusty. They will, here in this building or at a funeral home, they will have Rusty in a box. And, they're going to read a very similar obituary to what Rusty provided me today. Maybe the exact same obituary. I don't know. Folks, let's let that be a reminder. Let's let that be a motivator. Finally, this morning, death is different to God than it is to you and I. Death is viewed differently by you and I than it's viewed by God. And it doesn't take us long to recognize that. Simply, God is not bound by time. God is not watching the clock. You and I watch the clock constantly. We live our lives completely engulfed in time. What the time is, what time we need to do things, and what time we need to be places. And God looks at death differently simply because He doesn't look at time. And part of why we're sad when we know someone that's passed away is because we recognize that we have no more time with that person here in this life. And we say that at funerals all the time. Well, it was their time came too soon, or their time was up, or I wish they had more time. But God doesn't view things in time like you and I are so inclined to do. In Ecclesiastes 7:1, if we back up a verse from what we just read it there, it says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. The day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Like I said, my son is too. I remember the day he was born very well, and whenever he was born and I held him, I didn't think that his death will be better. I didn't think that. What a great thing birth is. We as humans, we love birth. Birth's a wonderful thing, and when a new human is born, we recognize this clean slate. We recognize this person who hasn't been touched by the world yet. And we're so thankful for the opportunities that they're going to have. And we want them to have this good life, and we want them to be close to God. Death or birth, in our eyes, is such a wonderful thing. And then we read here that the day of death is better. Do you believe that? Do you believe that your death will be better than your birth? It's a hard pill for us to swallow. It's a hard thing for us to think about. In our world, death is such a horrible thing. It's the worst thing. We give murderers the worst sentences in prisons. And the Bible tells us it's better than birth. I think that's because of time. I think that's because of our perspective and having a worldly perspective versus having a godly perspective. Satan told Job, and skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath, will he give for his life. Rule of thumb, if Satan says something, don't believe it. He's probably lying. He's good at it. But if you're not a child of God today, if you've not been washed in Jesus' blood today, listen to Satan. Take Satan's advice. If you're not in good standing with God today, take his advice Give everything you can for this physical life because it is the greatest thing you will ever have. It's the best you'll ever get if you've not been washed in Jesus' blood. Give everything up, give everyone up in pursuit of a great life. We know that Satan, he's lying here. He's deceiving here. And we know that we shouldn't put as much stock in our physical life as Satan implies here, especially if we're a Christian. You know, Jesus recognized how great life here on this earth is, even. Jesus didn't have this earthly mindset that Satan talks about here in the last verse. You know, when Judas died, Jesus wept. He wept. And you and I do that too. When we go to a funeral, somebody that we love, somebody that we care about, or we recognize that and we see that when we're sitting at the back and the people at the front of the funeral, they're crying, they're weeping. And you know what we know? They loved him. The Jews that were there, they saw Jesus, they saw the Son of God weeping, and they said, He loved him. He loved him. And we do that too when people we love die. Knowing all these things we've talked about all morning, knowing that death is inevitable, knowing that we have an appointment with death, that there's a time to be born, there's a time to die. Even so, it's sad. And we recognize that. I don't think it's that Jesus had some earthly mindset. I think it's that He loved him. But the culmination of our study this morning in the last verse that we're going to read is in Psalms chapter 116 and verse 15. This is the verse that, as I started thinking about this sermon, this was the verse that started all of that. It says, "They're precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints." Very similar to Ecclesiastes 7:1 or 7:2, whichever one we read just a moment ago. That the day of death is better than the day of birth. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. We read this at funerals all the time, don't we? All the time. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. Just like with that verse in Ecclesiastes, do you believe this? Do you believe it? Now, to believe this is not to say it's not sad, that we shouldn't or can't be sad about that. That word precious there, the Hebrew word, it means valuable, costly, excellent. It's a valuable thing. Valuable in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. Do we see value when a saint dies? That's what God sees. When my son was born, I saw value. And that's when all of it clicked. And that's when it all started to make sense. You and I view birth the way God views death. Let me say it one more time. You and I view birth the way God views death. When Zane was born, the word we heard more than anything was precious. He's precious. Because of the importance that we put on birth. Because of how much of a wonderful thing birth is to you and I. Folks, when God sees a Christian on their deathbed, we see someone who's weak, we see somebody who's vulnerable, someone who can't help themselves, someone who's so near the end of their life, and God sees something that's precious, that's so close to precious. When we found out we were going to have Zealand, we made a lot of preparations for him. We remodeled an entire room for him. It was a months-long process. We tore out the sheetrock and we replaced the insulation and we put in new sheetrock and we painted and we brought in new floor and then Hallie and I, we got the crib and we brought it into his room and we put the crib together and we she decorated the room and we did all the things. We already loved him. And we were just preparing to have him. There were highs and there were lows when Hallie was pregnant. She would vomit at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's pretty low when you're cleaning up someone else's vomit at 2 o'clock in the morning. She was sick a lot. But there were highs too. We grew closer through that process. And when she's standing there and she's pregnant and she's hurting and she's sick and she's folding your clothes, you know she loves you. She's doing the dishes, you know she loves me. And that's a good thing. That was a good moment. And when I'm cleaning up her vomit at 2 o'clock in the morning, she knew, she better have known that I love her. That I love her. And people would say to us, we can't wait for him to be here. We can't wait for him to arrive. And I'd look over there. He was right there the whole time. I didn't know that. And think he's right here. But I knew what they meant. They meant we can't wait for him to be out here with us. And that's what we wanted too. You know, as Zealand's father, I wanted to have him. I wanted to hold him. I wanted to take care of him. I wanted to protect him and know that he was safe in my arms. That's what I wanted. I think that's what God wants. When he sees that person that we see as weak, as vulnerable, and God sees someone who's never been stronger, who's so close. He saw the highs and the lows in their life. He saw when they were disobedient to him and they didn't love him and they didn't want him. He saw when they devoted their life to him and they gave their life to him, and when they avoided sin when they didn't have to. He saw the highs. He said he's gone and he's preparing this place for them. He's building this place just for them. And here they are. And they're so close to that precious site. And God the Father, he just wants to have them. He wants to hold them. He wants to protect. And know that they're safe from sin, from this world. Folks, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. What a precious, what a wonderful thing. What a wonderful assurance to know where that saint is.